We'll call Rod Forney to the stand, please.
Please raise your right hand and be sworn.
Yes, I do.
Please be seated. State and spell your name for the record.
Rod, R-O-D, Forney, F-O-R-N-E-Y.
Thank you.
Sir, what is your current occupation?
I'm a detective for the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office.
You've been so employed for what period of time?
For the Sheriff's Department, approximately 11 years.
And as a detective?
As a detective for approximately 5 years.
And your current assignment is what?
As a detective in the Coastal Operations Bureau, which is in Carpinteria.
Were you called to assist on the execution of a search warrant back on the 18th of November, 2003, at an office in Beverly Hills?
Yes, I was.
Do you happen to remember the address?
It was 211 South Beverly Drive, and it was suite, or room number 108.
Do you recall whose office it was?
Yes, sir, I do.
And whose office was it?
Bradley Miller's.
And your responsibilities that day were what?
To seize evidence.
All right. And did you, in fact, seize evidence at that time?
Yes, I did.
Now, there's 3 photographs in front of you. Go ahead and grab those and take a look at those photographs. Are those, in fact, exhibit numbers 831, 832 and 833?
Yes, they are.
And can you tell us what those are, 831, 832 and 833?
They're photographs of items I had seized from Mr. Miller's office.
All right. And in front of you are a series of objects. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes.
I'd like to show you each of these items, please, consecutively by number, and tell me if you recognize these items. Starting with Court Exhibit 823.
Yes, I recognize that.
Is that an item that you seized?
Yes, it is.
And turned over to Sergeant Caldwell?
Yes, I did.
And does that have a sheriff's number associated with it?
Yes, it does.
And what is that number?
Which, there's numerous numbers that are associated with it. This is item number 811 and its tag number 122,980.
Okay, we'll do the item numbers on this case. That was item number 811, is that right?
Yes, it is.
In this case, the court number is 824. And tell us what it is, please.
It's item number 812, another videotape.
It's a videotape. And you seized that item as well?
Yes, I did.
And item number 825, and this is Court Exhibit 825, what is that?
This is actually item number 815, and it's a videotape.
When you say 815, do you mean Sheriff's number 815?
That's correct.
And it's a videotape as well?
Yes.
And the next one is Court Exhibit 826. Tell us what this is.
It's Sheriff's item number 816. And it's also a videotape that I seized.
All right. And the next one would be Court Exhibit number 827. What is that?
Okay. This is an audio tape that I seized. It is Sheriff's item number 817.
And then the next one? Quick, before it falls out of the bag. Court Exhibit number 828?
This is Sheriff's item number 818. And it's another audio tape that I seized.
All right. And then Court Exhibit number 829, what is this?
It's Sheriff's item number 819. And it is a small videotape, digital videotape.
And each of these items that you seized and turned over to Sergeant Caldwell, from where did you retrieve those items?
I retrieved them from like an entertainment unit in the conference room of Bradley Miller's office.
Your Honor, the 3 photographs are currently in evidence. May I publish them at this time?
Yes.
We have to switch over to input, is it 4?
I'll get it.
The exhibit is 831 that we're looking at this time. Tell us, please, in which room in Mr. Miller's office is this?
It would be what I would refer to as the conference room.
All right. And can you tell us what we're looking at in this photograph?
We're looking at the videotapes and audio tapes that I had seized.
This is item number 833 currently on the board. Can you tell us what this is?
Those are some of the tapes that I had seized that were in the same location.
And then finally 832?
Those are also tapes that I had seized from the same location.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Detective Forney.
Yes.
How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Good. How long have you been a detective?
Approximately 5 years.
And how long have you been a deputy sheriff?
A deputy sheriff for 11 years total.
11 total, including the 5 as a detective?
Yes, and then another 14 as a police officer.
And with what department?
Bakersfield Police Department.
Okay. Did you have assignments there other than patrol?
Yes, I did.
Were you assigned to detectives at any time?
I was sort of a street-level vice, narcotics unit and also traffic as a motor officer.
Okay, so would you just tell us, that's 20-some years anyway?
25 years.
Alright, and you were assigned to work on the case regarding Mr. Jackson, is that correct?
Yes, I was.
And your assignment was to go to the premises of Bradley Miller in Beverly Hills and execute a search warrant, is that right?
That's correct.
Were you assigned to do anything other than that?
No.
Alright, you're familiar. Based on your training, you've had training through a post academy, I take it, right?
That's correct.
And then you've had in-service training at 2 different departments you work at, right?
Yes.
And you would agree that chain of custody is a pretty important aspect of handling evidence, is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's what we have all these bags for with tape on them and initials and dates and all that, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, Mr. Zonen made a remark about something falling out of a bag. You want the evidence to be in the bag that it was put in so that you can show that there is a chain of custody, correct?
That's correct.
And so you wouldn't want to, for instance, find a random piece of evidence at the bottom of a box that fell out of its bag, would you?
No.
Alright. Now, let me just ask you a question or two about the pictures that were up on the board, and I won't put them back up. But basically, when you did this search, you realized you were searching a private investigator's office, is that correct?
That's correct.
In the course of searching that office, you found things that seemed to be consistent with this being an office of a private investigator, is that correct?
That's correct.
There was office equipment and computers, correct?
Yes.
And there were videotapes.
Yes.
Is that correct? There were audio tapes?
Yes.
There were tapes other than the tapes that you seized in this particular investigation, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you would agree there's nothing unusual about investigators having surveillance tapes, is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Alright, okay, thank you. No further questions.
Oh, I have no further questions.
Thank you. You may step down.
Michael Davy. He should be outside.
For the jury, during our last hearing you weren't present for, we decided to not have court on Friday. So we've worked long and hard, a lot of days in a row, and the district attorney has told us that he expects to end his case probably by the end of next week. So, considering some issues that we have to decide in your absence, we're all going to take Friday off, not just you. So, remember, there won't be court tomorrow afternoon, and there won't be court Friday now. Come forward.
Mr. Davy, go right up to the front, please.
Remain standing. Face the clerk. Raise your right hand.
Yes.
Please be seated. State and spell your name for the record.
My name is Michael Davy. Last name is Davy.
Thank you.
Mr. Davy, we're going to need you to scoot up closer to that microphone, if you can. It's been a constant problem. But you have to lean into it so everybody can hear what you have to say, okay?
Okay.
You're retired, are you not?
Yes.
And what did you do before you were lucky enough to retire?
I worked for the Los Angeles City School District as a teacher, a counselor and an administrator.
For how long were you employed by the school district?
32 years.
During the time that you worked for the school district, were you at some point in time assigned to John Burroughs?
Yes.
And what grades does John Burroughs cover?
6th, 7th and 8th.
So it's 3 years, then?
Right.
And what is the size of the school, approximately, when you were there?
When I was there, it was about 2,400.
Now, during the year 2002, okay. The school year 2002-2003, alright. What were your assignments at John Burroughs?
I was a grade level counselor.
And for how long were you assigned that responsibility?
I worked there 5 years, and I was in that assignment for about 3.5 years.
At some point during the school year of 2002-2003, were you reassigned some other responsibilities within John Burroughs?
Yes.
And what was your new assignment?
I became an administrator in charge of attendance.
Alright, now, let's go back to the first one. You were a counselor?
Right.
Did you also have teaching responsibilities?
No.
Full-time counselor?
Yes.
And how many other counselors were there in the school, do you recall?
Yes. There's one for each grade level, and there was a special needs counselor, so there was 3, a total of 4 counselors.
During the time that you were a counselor and working at John Burroughs, did you meet 2 students by the name of Gavin Arvizo and Star Arvizo?
Yes.
And did you meet their mother?
Yes.
Do you recall her name?
Yes.
What was that?
Janet Ventura.
So she was known to you as Janet Ventura.
Right.
And were the boys known to you as Ventura or Arvizo?
Arvizo.
Now, at some point in time you were assigned as an administrator, correct?
Correct.
What are the responsibilities, or what were those new responsibilities to you as administrator?
It was to process students during the enrollment process, and to process them if they were leaving the campus, leaving the school, transferring to another school or school district. And it was also to make monthly reports to the district on our attendance status. And to find out where kids were that were not coming to school.
At some point during the school year of 2002 and 2003, you transitioned from counselor to administrator, correct?
Correct.
Can you tell us approximately when that transition occurred?
Well, the person that I replaced went out on leave, so I was just temporarily filling that person's job in the early parts of January, February, and March. And at some point, that person retired and I took the job permanently.
So the earliest point would have been January, February, March of 2003?
Right.
Okay, let me show you a photograph, if I might. Just take a look at it for a second. I've handed you a photograph that I believe has the number 338 on the tag. Is that correct?
Yes.
Alright, and in that photograph, do you recognize anybody in the photograph?
I recognize Star and Gavin, and I assume the third person is their sister, but I never met her.
Okay, but the 2 males in the photograph are Star and Gavin?
Right.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you a few questions about Star and Gavin, okay?
Okay.
To your knowledge, were they attending John Burroughs during some portion of the school year during 2002-2003?
Yes.
And during the time that they were at the school, were you a counselor to them?
Yes.
Or let's take them one at a time. Were you a counselor to Gavin?
Yes.
Were you a counselor to Star?
Yes.
So that would have been what grade?
7th grade.
7th. Now, later, when you were in charge of attendance, did it come to your attention that Star and Gavin were not attending school?
Yes.
And as a result of that information, what did you do? What course of action did you take?
I notified our pupil services counselor that I was unable to reach the house by phone, and I asked him to go out there and make a home visit.
Does this gentleman, is this a male or a female?
It's a male.
And what's his name?
Stephen Kaufman.
Okay. And did you ever hear back from Mr. Kaufman as to whether or not he was able to make contact with the family?
Yes, he reported back the same day that he was unable to make contact, and that he had left his card there, and that he had talked to neighbors, but was unable to find out where they were.
At some point after this conversation that you had with Mr. Kaufman, did you receive a telephone call from Janet Arvizo?
I did.
Now, let's go back just in point in time. Prior to this telephone call, okay?
Yes.
Had you met Mrs. Arvizo personally?
Yes.
Mrs. Ventura, I guess, as she was known to you.
Yes.
And on how many occasions did you meet Mrs. Ventura?
Numerous. She came up to school regularly.
And how would you describe her in terms of her cooperation with you and the school?
She was very supportive of our efforts.
Now, at the time that you received a telephone call from her after Mr. Kaufman had gone out to her house and been unable to locate her, okay?
Yes.
With regard to that telephone conversation, did you find anything unusual or different about that telephone call with Mrs. Ventura than your previous contacts with her?
Objection. Vague and leading.
Sustained. Sustained.
On which ground, Your Honor? Just so I know.
Vague.
During the course of your conversation with Mrs. Ventura after Mr. Kaufman went out to the house, how would you describe her demeanor?
It wasn't forthcoming.
Was that unusual, in your opinion?
Yes.
And when the subject, would you tell us what the subject matter of the conversation was?
Right.
Objection. Hearsay.
Sustained.
With regard to the conversation that you had with Mrs. Ventura, okay. Did it involve the attendance of the kids at school?
Objection. Leading.
Overruled.
Yes.
And as a result of the conversation with Mrs. Ventura, did you give her some information that was necessary with regard to the kids' future attendance at school?
Yes.
All right. What did you tell her?
They had been gone more than 10 days, and I said that I needed her to bring them back to school or check them out. And she said to me that.
Objection. Hearsay.
Your Honor, it's offered as circumstantial evidence with regard to her state of mind at this particular point in time.
The objection is sustained.
Okay. So without telling us what she said, would you tell us what you said to her, what instructions you gave her?
Right. I told her that I needed the students to either return to school or to check out. And she said it was not.
You can't tell us what she said.
Objection. Hearsay.
She said something in response to that, correct?
Yes.
And then did you say anything back to her?
I told her we cannot keep the kids on our books as students at the school for any longer than we already had. And that if it was going to be an extended stay, they were going to be gone for a while, they needed to be checked out. And when they were available to come back to school, we would check them back in.
All right. And did you give Mrs. Ventura some directions as to what was necessary to check the children out of school?
Right.
Tell us what you told her.
I asked her to come in and check the students out. She said that wasn't.
Objection. Hearsay.
Sustained.
Okay. So you asked her to personally come in and do it?
Yes.
Okay. And she said something back to you?
Right.
And as a result of that, did you give her further direction as to what procedurally would have to be followed to get those children out of school?
Right.
Tell us what you told her.
I indicated that if she was unable to come, that we needed someone with a note from her, and her driver's license, and that person needed to be able to have an ID also. And that we needed the textbooks returned, and to do it quickly, to do it soon.
All right. At that point in time, did you become aware of the fact that somebody came to check the children out of school?
Yes. She said that somebody would come in a day or two.
And did you write a note to somebody to expect this to happen?
I wrote a note to my secretary that a person would be coming with her ID and his ID and pay for the books, and to direct that person to the bookroom to pay for any textbooks that weren't there.
Now, did you at some point actually meet somebody who came to check the boys out of school?
I did.
And do you remember the name of that person?
Yes. It was Mr. Amen. Vincent Amen.
All right. And did you personally deal with him on the checkout procedure?
The secretary gave him the paperwork and made copies of his ID and Miss Ventura's driver's license, and she kept the note that was sent along with him. And, I spoke to him briefly, but I didn't handle the nuts and bolts of it. The secretary did.
And were some books paid for on that particular occasion?
Books were paid for, yes.
By whom?
By Vincent Amen.
All right. I'm going to show you some exhibits. Counsel, it will be 271 and 272. I want you to take a look at the exhibit that's been marked as 271A and ask if you recognize that.
Yes.
That exhibit is actually in evidence. And how do you recognize it?
It's my note to the secretary.
That's in your handwriting, correct?
Yes.
What's the date of that note?
February 5th. I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses on. March 5th.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
March 5th.
All right. Was that note prepared at the time of that date?
I think it I prepared it the day that I had the phone call.
Okay.
I had the conversation.
Alright. Turn the next page to page B, if you would. Do you recognize page B?
Yes.
And with regard to page B, what is that?
That's a school form that we use when students check out.
And for what student is that?
This is for Gavin Arvizo.
And does it indicate the destination?
It does.
As what?
Phoenix, Arizona.
Alright, let's go to C, if we can. And this is 271C. What is that document?
It is a note from Miss Arvizo.
That's a document that you indicated she needed as part of the process if she was going to have somebody else check them out?
Yes.
Okay. And lastly, 271D, what's that?
These are copies of Miss Arvizo's, or Miss Ventura's ID, driver's license, and Mr. Amen's driver's license.
Okay. Now, let's move to 272, if we can. All we need you to do is just flip this over. Thank you. And 272A, which is in evidence, what is that?
It's the checkout sheet for Star Arvizo.
And is the destination indicated on that also?
Yes. Phoenix, Arizona.
And the next page, which would be 272B.
It's a note from Miss Ventura to check out Star.
Okay. And on the last page, on the back side of that is what?
That's the school form where the teachers sign the student's checkout form and put a grade there.
And does that indicate that books were paid for on that form?
It does.
Alright, I'll take that. Thank you. During the time that, I want to make it more particular, but, well, during the school year 2002 and 2003 okay. At John Burroughs, was there an instructor there by the name of Mr. Gerald?
Yes. Mr. Gerald, yes.
Gerald. And how long have you known Mr. Gerald?
5 years.
And had you worked at the same school with him?
Yes.
During that 5-year period?
Right.
And what was Mr. Gerald's position with the school?
He was a classroom teacher, and he also handled the detention room. And in the mornings, he didn't have a homeroom. He processed students that were late to school.
Did the manner in which Mr. Gerald interacted with some of the students and parents at the school cause problems?
Yes.
In what respect?
He had a kind of paramilitary demeanor about him. He was kind of a drill instructor, in your face, you know. Kind of shouty, loud, and, you know, you need to do this, and, just aggressive.
And did that cause problems with some of the students?
It did.
Did it cause problems with some of the parents?
It did.
And did the school have to take actions towards him to try to calm down his behavior?
Yes.
Now, at some point, I didn't ask you this, but I should have. The documents that, 71, sick, and 72, sick, that show that Gavin and Star were checked out of the school, those were completed on the day that the children were checked out?
Yes.
That's correct?
Yes.
That would have been in March of 2003?
Right.
Now, did Gavin and Star come back to John Burroughs later?
Yes.
Do you remember approximately when it was?
About 3 weeks later.
Now, do you recall an incident in which a person by the name of Major J. Jackson came to contact you?
Objection. Leading.
Overruled. You may answer.
Yes.
And do you know who Major J. Jackson is?
I do.
Where did you first meet Mr. J. Jackson, Major J. Jackson?
I met him in my office when I was having a conference with Gavin's mother, and he attended with her.
Now, on the particular day when Major Jackson approached you, do you remember approximately when that was in relationship to the kids coming back to school, Gavin and Star?
Yes.
Alright, tell the jury.
It was shortly thereafter. Within a few days or a week.
And where were you when Major Jackson approached you?
I was in front of the school.
I'm sorry?
In front of John Burroughs.
And could you describe his demeanor at the time that he approached you?
All right, he was agitated. He said that there was a
Objection. Hearsay.
It's offered to explain the conduct of this witness in response to the information that was provided.
All sustain the hearsay objection.
Alright, I don't know if we got an answer to the first part, so I'll just start over again. And don't tell us what Major Jackson told you, okay?
Okay.
Would you describe his demeanor when he first approached you?
He was agitated.
Alright, And without telling us what he said, did he say something to you?
Yes.
That caused you to do something?
Yes.
Alright. As a result of the information that you received from Major Jackson, what did you do?
I went down to the street and approached a car that had a gentleman in it that was videotaping students.
Did you actually see the camera?
Yes.
And where was the camera at the first point that you saw it?
In the driver's hand.
And in what direction was it pointed?
Out the windshield.
Now, let's pause for just a second, if we can, and go back. At what point in the school day was it that Major Jackson approached you?
It was dismissal time.
Can you describe to the jury what it's like at John Burroughs at dismissal time in terms of the traffic flow?
John Burroughs is situated in a residential area between two major streets. And at dismissal time, the only way out of the school is through the front or the north and south end of the school. You can't exit the back of the school because there's houses back there. So the vast majority of these 2,400 kids leave out the front or the side, but they end up in front of school. And there's school buses out there, and there are parents, a lot of parents there to pick up their students. So you have a traffic jam for about 15 or 20 minutes where the traffic flow is very, very slow. Only about 5 or 6 cars can go through the light at a time, because the students crossing the street hold up traffic. So it will take you 15 minutes to go from one end of the block to the other at dismissal time.
Now, at the time that you approached this car, do you remember what kind of a car it was?
Generally, yes.
Tell us.
It was a Nissan sports car.
And where was this car in terms of the relationship with this traffic flow at the point?
It was in gridlock. It was in front of school in the gridlock.
Were you actually able to go up to the driver of the car?
Yes. Yeah, that's.
Did you have a conversation with the driver of the car?
I walked up to the driver and I told him that he couldn't videotape students. And I said, I need you to stop videotaping students. And he said, okay, and set the camera down on the seat or the floor of the car.
Did you write down the license number of the car?
I did not.
Was there any school security available to you on this particular day?
On that particular day, the school police officer was not present. And I gave him a note the next day describing the car and telling him the situation.
No further questions.
Good afternoon, Mr. Davy.
Good afternoon.
My name is Thomas Mesereau. I speak for Mr. Jackson. When did you first meet the Arvizo family?
Fall of 2002.
Okay, and was that when Gavin and Star entered your school?
Yes.
And Gavin and Star entered your school approximately November of 2002, right?
Yes.
What grades were they in?
7th.
Okay, they both were in 7th?
Yes.
Okay.
I think Gavin had lost a year. He's older, but he had lost a year from his health problems.
Okay, and had you known them before they entered your school in November of 2002?
No.
Had you known anyone else in the family before they entered your school in 2002?
No.
Gavin was consistently a disciplinary problem, correct?
Correct.
His behavior was disruptive and challenging, in your own words, correct?
Correct.
Gavin would routinely act up in class, right?
Correct.
He would display poor cooperation with students and teachers, right?
Right.
He would create situations in which he had an audience to view his poor behavior, right?
Yes.
His grades were low throughout his education, right?
They were at John Burroughs.
Yes. Pardon me.
Yes.
His grades at John Burroughs were consistently low, correct?
Yes. Yes.
And you felt he didn't apply himself in a constructive manner in school, right?
Yes.
You had a number of parent meetings with Gavin, Janet and Jay in which Gavin's poor behavior was discussed at length, correct?
Correct.
And you felt that Gavin was the kind of young man who could handle himself with adults, right?
He thought he was the kind of person.
You felt he could handle himself with adults also, didn't you?
He was pretty glib, yes.
You did actually write a report. Excuse me, not write a report. You gave an interview where you actually made that statement, did you not, about Gavin? That he can handle himself with adults.
Yes.
Okay, you looked at his school records at one point, correct?
I don't recall that.
Do you recall concluding that Gavin's grades at your school were very similar to his grades at other schools he had attended?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. It calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
Did you yourself ever look at Gavin's grades from other schools and compare them to the grades he got at your school?
I don't recall that.
Do you remember being interviewed by a Sergeant Steve Roble of the Santa Barbara Sheriff's Office?
Yes.
Do you remember telling Sheriff Roble that you saw a consistent pattern of poor grades from school to school with Gavin?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. It's hearsay. It calls for reliance on hearsay records.
Overruled.
I honestly don't recall it.
Might it refresh your recollection to look at a police report about your interview?
Okay.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Mr. Davy, have you had a chance to look at that report? Does it refresh your recollection about what you told Sheriff Roble about that issue?
Yes.
And what did you tell him?
That he had consistently underperformed in his academic pursuits.
Do you recall that you were asked if you had seen any change in Gavin's demeanor, attitude, or academic performance from the period prior to February 2003 to the time Gavin returned to school on March 17, 2003?
Yes.
Do you recall your saying you had seen no definitive change in Gavin's demeanor, attitude, or academic performance during that period?
Yes.
Now, Gavin had a truancy counselor, correct?
Well, are you talking about Mr. Kaufman?
Yes.
Well, Mr. Kaufman was an itinerant. He came to school 2 or 3 days a week and he would get computer readouts of people who had long-term absences.
Okay, is the appropriate label for him truancy counselor?
No, it's pupil service and attendance counselor.
Okay, and you said he would come 3 days a week?
Yeah, oftentimes schools have to buy that time. So sometimes the school would buy 2 days and another school would buy 3 days, so he would split the assignment.
Okay, and did you discuss issues involving Gavin with Mr. Kaufman?
I don't know about issues. I asked him to go to Gavin's house.
Okay, and the purpose was to talk to the family about why Gavin wasn't going to school.
Right, at that point in time.
Okay, now, you indicated to the prosecutor that at some point someone named Vinnie Amen came to the school to check Gavin and Star out, is that correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Amen provided the school with a copy of his identification, correct?
Correct.
And he gave the school a copy of his New Jersey driver's license for the school files, right?
Right.
And to your knowledge, did he sign anything when he was checking these 2 students out? Do you know?
I don't know.
But your understanding was that Janet had given him permission to check out Gavin and Star, right?
Right.
I object, Your Honor. It calls for a conclusion.
Sustained.
In your response to the prosecutor's questions, correct me if I'm wrong, did you say something to the effect that the school had permission from Janet to allow Mr. Amen to check out these 2 students?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. Calls for hearsay.
His state of mind, Your Honor. I believe he testified to it on direct.
The objection is sustained. I believe you objected to the same testimony.
Okay. At some point, was it your understanding that Mr. Amen did, in fact, check out the 2 students?
Yes.
Okay, and what would the normal procedure be for allowing someone not in the family to check out a student?
A permission slip written by the parent.
Okay, and did you follow the normal procedure when Mr. Amen was checking out Gavin and Star?
Yes.
Do you know how many meetings you had with Ms. Arvizo about Gavin's poor behavior?
Not an exact number, no.
And when Gavin was checked out of the school, how long had he been attending that school, if you remember?
Well, just months, since November. So November to late February.
And would it be accurate to say that even though he was only there a few months, it became readily apparent that he was a disciplinary problem, right?
Yes.
The disciplinary problems began. The disciplinary problems with Gavin began in November of 2002, right?
I don't recollect the first time.
But certainly around that time, correct?
Probably.
Now, what typically is the procedure you follow at this school if somebody has a disciplinary problem?
Object as immaterial, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Do you recall Gavin being late to class?
Not specifically, but I'm guessing that he was.
Object. Move to strike. Speculation. That part beyond the.
It's stricken.
Would it refresh your recollection to look at some school records in that regard?
Sure.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Mr. Davy, have you had a chance to look at those records?
Yes.
Did they refresh your recollection about disciplinary problems you had at your school with Gavin Arvizo?
Yes.
Excuse me, Your Honor. I'm going to object to the question. That wasn't the question that he was refreshing. I won't talk anymore, but I don't believe that's the question.
That's correct. It's not.
Let me rephrase my question, Your Honor. I'll withdraw that one. Mr. Davy, does the document you just looked at refresh your recollection about Gavin being late to class?
Yes.
And was that a problem with him while he attended your school?
On occasion, yes.
Do you recall a problem with Gavin banging on doors at your school?
Yes.
Do you recall Gavin being consistently warned about his bad behavior?
Yes.
Do you recall problems with Gavin arguing with teachers?
Yes.
Do you recall problems with Gavin arguing with students?
No, I don't.
Would it refresh your recollection just to look at those records again?
Sure.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Have you had a chance to look at that record?
Yes.
Your Honor, before counsel asks his next question, I want to interpose an objection to lack of foundation as to whether he's aware of those records. Has he ever seen them?
Just refreshing recollection, Your Honor.
All right. The objection as to lack of foundation is overruled.
Do you recall, Mr. Davy, problems with Gavin arguing with another student?
From those records, yes.
Do you recall a problem with Gavin having a negative impact on his class?
Yes.
Do you recall problems with him jumping around, quote, like retarded people?
Yes.
Do you recall problems with Gavin mumbling in class?
Yes.
Do you recall your having to detain Gavin for disciplinary problems?
Yes.
And what is the detention procedure that you would have used with him?
Well, basically you have to stay after school for an hour.
Okay, and do you recall a problem with him that required lunch detention?
Well, a number of people can assign detention, so I don't recall that. But I'm guessing that he served lunch detention.
Would it refresh your recollection if I just show you the records?
If it's there, it happened.
May I approach, Your Honor?
I think the problem that we have is that I overruled an objection by Mr. Sneddon about foundation. But when counsel asks you if it refreshes your recollection, that doesn't mean that you then testify about what's in the record. It means do you independently remember this? For example, do you know if he was late for school? And you say, I don't remember. Then he says, well, will this refresh your recollection? And you look at it. And that's asking you, do you remember seeing him be late for school? Not, what does the record say?
Okay, I misunderstood that.
Okay, so.
The fact.
You don't need to come back to it. But the point where it is, you want to ask him if he can refresh his recollection about, what was it?
About Gavin having been detained at lunch.
Okay, would looking at these records help you refresh your recollection about being detained at lunch?
No, simply because oftentimes those are reflections of dean's entries or another counselor's entries.
Judge, could I, excuse me, counsel?
Yeah.
I don't want to be burdensome, but I think that I would move to strike.
Microphone.
I don't want to be burdensome, but I move to strike all of the questions that he's used to refresh recollection until the proper foundation can be established that this witness actually remembered that, as opposed to some record.
I believe, Your Honor, the witness has said he remembers it and spoke to a sheriff in an interview and made those conclusions.
Well, the problem that's come up is whether or not he was refreshing his memory to things he actually can remember, or if he was just telling you what you showed him in the record. So what I'll do is go back and sustain the foundation objection that he made before you asked him these series of questions relating to Gavin's behavior and strike those answers. And then you can proceed again to see
Okay.
what he remembers and what was just in the record.
Mr. Davy, I want to go back over some questions I asked you earlier. Now, You were interviewed by Sheriff Steve Roble of the Santa Barbara Sheriff's Office approximately December 4, 2003. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And that was at your school in Hollywood, right?
In Hancock Park, yeah.
And for the purpose of that interview, you obtained Gavin's cumulative school files and his disciplinary file, correct?
I did. But one of the things that you need to understand is that there was another office that also handled discipline, other than the counseling office. And so some of the records that I think you're referring to came out of that office.
Okay, but you did tell Sergeant Roble that you had obtained Gavin's cumulative school files and his discipline file from Bonnie Mesereau, right?
She took my place when I transferred, so she wasn't there at that time.
Do you recall telling Sergeant Roble that you had obtained Gavin's cumulative school files and his discipline file from Bonnie Mesereau?
I believe that was after I left the school.
Okay, but you did obtain those files, correct?
I went to obtain them. I think they were under subpoena.
Do you recall meeting with Sergeant Steve Roble in a principal's office to review and discuss the file's contents?
Yes.
And you did, in fact, discuss those contents with Sergeant Roble, right?
Yes.
You gave Sergeant Roble a brief history of the schools Gavin had recently attended, true?
True.
They were LeConte Middle School for 6th grade, right?
Your Honor, I'm going to object as hearsay.
Sustained.
Had you counseled Gavin in your position at Burroughs?
Yes.
And what had you counseled Gavin about?
Disruptive behavior in the classroom.
Why did you counsel Gavin about his disruptive behavior in the classroom?
Your Honor, this has been asked and answered.
If it's in the record, Your Honor, I don't have a problem. But I wasn't sure if you'd ask me to go over this again.
Not this. Sorry, I apologize.
The objection is overruled.
Why did you counsel Gavin?
I was receiving referrals from his classroom teachers.
Were they negative referrals?
Yes.
Were they consistently negative referrals?
Yes.
Was it normal procedure when you received consistently negative referrals about a student that you try to counsel that student?
Yes.
Did you have many counseling sessions with Gavin about his poor behavior?
Yes.
And do you know approximately how many you had?
Probably a half a dozen.
Did you counsel him individually or with others present, if you know?
Individually.
Is that the normal procedure for that type of counseling?
Yes. Oftentimes with a parent, too, present.
Did you also counsel Gavin with any parent present?
Yes.
And what parent was typically present for those meetings?
Miss Ventura, and sometimes Miss Ventura and Mr. Jackson.
Okay. Did you tell Ms. Ventura that Gavin's behavior was disruptive and challenging?
Yes.
Did you tell Ms. Ventura that Gavin would routinely act up in class?
Yes.
Did you tell Ms. Ventura that he displayed poor cooperation with students and teachers?
Yes.
Did you tell Ms. Ventura that Gavin would create situations in which he had an audience to view his poor behavior?
Yes.
And did you tell Ms. Ventura that his grades were consistently low throughout his schooling?
I think she knew that.
Okay. Do you recall meeting with Jay Jackson to talk about Gavin's poor behavior?
With Miss Ventura present.
Yes. But you did meet with Miss Ventura and Jay Jackson to talk about Gavin's consistently disruptive behavior, right?
Yes. Yes.
And Gavin was present at those meetings, correct?
Correct.
And you told Ms. Ventura that you had seen no definitive change in Gavin's demeanor or attitude or academic performance from the period prior to February 2003 to the time following his return to school on March 17, 2003, right?
Right.
Now, you indicated that at some point, Mr. Kaufman went to Gavin's home. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you know where that was?
Not offhand. I mean, we use school records for that. I don't have access to that right now.
To your knowledge, did Mr. Kaufman find anyone home?
No.
Did you meet with Mr. Kaufman to talk about that issue?
Yes.
Was it Mr. Kaufman's responsibility to try and locate Ms. Arvizo?
Yes.
And at some point, to your knowledge, he did locate her, correct?
Well, what they typically do is talk to neighbors and leave business cards with people. And at some point she contacted me.
She contacted you and gave her permission to have Mr. Amen check out her sons, correct?
Correct.
Object. Calls for a conclusion. It's the same question that was asked before.
Sustained.
Do you recall a problem with Gavin Arvizo singing in the classroom?
No.
Would it refresh your recollection to look at these school records?
Like I said, those records may have been written by someone else.
Okay, well, the question would be if you remember.
No, I do not.
Is it possible they would refresh your recollection about that, since you counseled him on those issues?
I wasn't the only person that counseled him.
Well, let me ask you this. You don't remember an issue of him singing in class, right?
Right.
If you look at some records, might they refresh your recollection about that problem?
Well, it will refresh my memory that it happened, but that I may not have handled it. I don't know who wrote those records.
I'm only asking you about your memory about whether it happened, okay?
I don't have a recollection.
Might it refresh your recollection to look at the records?
I'm going to object to the question. He says, it's asked and answered.
All right, the witness is just trying to follow my instructions. Go ahead and show him the record.
Thank you, Your Honor. Have you had a chance to look at that school record?
I have.
Does it refresh your recollection about any problem in that regard?
No.
Okay, do you recall problems with Gavin disrupting test taking?
No.
Is that something you recall counseling him about?
My general recollections of counseling him were disruptive behavior. Specifically whether it was testing or singing, whatever, I can't speak to that.
Okay, did you talk to various teachers at the school about Gavin's consistently disruptive behavior?
Yes.
How many teachers did you talk to about his disruptive behavior, if you remember?
Well, I'm sure I spoke to the ones that were writing referrals.
Were a lot of his teachers writing referrals?
The students at that grade level were in a group of teachers that had the same students all day. So generally, if one teacher had a problem in that group, they all had a problem.
Now, the prosecutor asked you questions about a teacher named Gerald, is that correct?
Gerald.
And I believe you said words to the effect you thought he was somewhat in a paramilitary kind of way?
Yes.
What did you mean by that?
Well, he had a kind of drill instructor demeanor, when he was dealing with students that were late to class or misbehaving.
But Gavin had many other teachers besides Mr. Gerald complaining about him, didn't he?
In fact, I don't think he had Mr. Gerald as a classroom teacher. I think he probably had him for his ROTC, his extracurricular.
So the disruptive behavior that you've been talking about was disruptive behavior in the classroom, correct?
Correct.
And those were classroom teachers that were referring these problems to you, right?
Correct.
Now, you said Mr. Gerald taught was it an after-school type of program?
Well, he was an 8th grade science teacher, but he also had an ROTC class that sometimes met after school and on Saturdays. And he also ran the detention room after school.
And did you think he was too strict in the ROTC program?
I don't know if he was too strict in his ROTC program.
Okay, but you mentioned his paramilitary behavior. Was that in the ROTC program?
No, that was in his dealing with students on the yard or in the morning when they were coming in late.
Okay. Do you recall him interacting with Gavin at all?
I do not recall that.
If he had, would it be because Gavin was late?
Object. Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Was one of Mr. Gerald's functions to deal with late students?
Yes.
And how would that work? If someone was late, how would they get to Mr. Gerald?
Well, he did not have a home room which met first thing in the morning, so Mr. Gerald was assigned to process students at the front door that were late coming in.
So he would simply wait at the front door?
Yeah, everybody had to pass through the front door. People with passes or notes from home would proceed on. People that didn't would be processed by him.
And the procedure, the procedure he followed if he met someone at the front door who was late was what? What would he do?
Well, he would write them a detention slip.
Okay, and would that detention slip be handed to the student?
Yes.
And was there a procedure dictating what the student should do with that detention slip?
Yes.
And what were they supposed to do with the detention slip?
1. They were supposed to get it signed by their parent and do their detention. It was an NCR paper, so we kept the copy.
Would the detention typically be done that day?
No.
When would it typically be done?
The next day after the parents were notified.
And was the proof that parents were notified their signature on the slip?
Yes.
Would someone actually talk to the parent directly?
Somebody from school?
Yes.
Not unless they didn't do the detention.
Okay, now, you do recall problems with Gavin being late, correct?
My recollection is more clear on the discipline inside the classroom, the disruption in the classroom.
Okay, now, when did you, excuse me, have you spoken to any prosecutor about your testimony today?
Yes.
And when was that?
Last night.
Okay, who did you speak to?
Mr. Sneddon.
Okay, did he call you?
Yes.
And you spoke to him about what you were going to be asked today?
He just looked at my grand jury testimony and had questions about that.
Okay, and did he ask you questions about what you would be saying today?
No, he was just clearing up what I had said, making him understand what I said during the grand jury testimony.
Have you reviewed your grand jury transcript?
I have.
And how did you get it?
I got it online.
Okay, and so you and Mr. Sneddon discussed what you said before the grand jury last night, right?
Yes.
Okay, how long a discussion was that?
20 minutes.
Okay, did you and Mr. Sneddon discuss Gavin's poor record for discipline in that call?
Briefly.
Excuse me?
Briefly.
Okay, did you and Mr. Sneddon discuss your interview with Sheriff Roble?
No.
You did discuss Mr. Gerald, correct?
Correct.
Did Mr. Sneddon bring up the name, Gerald, in that conversation?
Yes.
Did he tell you he would ask you questions about Mr. Gerald today?
I don't think so. He just wanted me to tell him about it.
In that conversation, did you inform Mr. Sneddon that Mr. Gerald had not actually been a classroom teacher for Gavin?
I don't think so.
Okay, did you talk about Mr. Gerald's responsibilities at the door of the school?
Yes.
Did you talk about his responsibilities in the ROTC program?
Briefly.
Okay.
Counsel?
Yes, Your Honor.
We'll take our break.
Yes.